I'm going to read from Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, and the first 8 verses. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe. And they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the second Easter now of this pandemic. And I guess 1 year ago, none of us really wanted to believe the warnings that we were hearing. The figures of potential and predicted deaths seemed like something out of a horror film. A year later, those figures now seem all too real. Nearly 130,000 people have died. And with every death, there's a family and there's a community of friends that are left shell-shocked, appalled at the loss of their loved one. For many, it will have been so difficult to adjust to the life that they now have to live without those who once walked alongside them, accompanying them on their journey through life. It feels like this Easter, more than any other I have experienced, we really need the message that is at the heart of the first Easter morning 2,000 years ago. These women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, had known Jesus for a number of years. They'd seen the quality of his life. They'd seen the kind of person that he was. They'd witnessed his miracles, listened to his teaching, and observed his interactions with the powerful and the powerless. They'd not only been onlookers to all of this, of course, they'd also personally been massively impacted by Jesus. Mary and Salome had become followers of Jesus and were also glad to see their children become some of his most devoted disciples. As for Mary Magdalene, she'd been personally the beneficiary of one of Jesus' miracles. Her life had been completely transformed by him. And all 3 women had followed Jesus as he journeyed around Galilee and then made the long journey down to Jerusalem. And it was there, in Jerusalem, that everything went tragically wrong for them. They had expected their experience of following Jesus to climax in Jerusalem. They weren't sure how, but they thought that it would probably be through Jesus being crowned king. But instead, within the space of a few hours, they'd seen him arrested, tried by a kangaroo court, condemned and crucified, wearing a crown of thorns, intended to ram home to all his followers how absurd his claims to being a king really were. These were traumatic events, and these women had seen it all unfold. They'd witnessed the object of all their hopes brutally executed, and with his death, their hopes were extinguished. Their grief must have been difficult to bear. All grief is, of course. But they were mourning not only the loss of the person they loved, but also the loss of a future they'd expected, a future that had filled them with excitement, a future that had filled their lives with meaning and with purpose. Their world had stopped spinning that Friday, and their sun had been extinguished. It's difficult when reflecting on the experience of these women not to think about all those families that have gone through the bitter experience of bereavement since last Easter. each experience being so brutal in its own way. A life ended, a story filled with memories, filled with love and hope, abruptly ended. Their loved ones were taken away by a disease no one had heard of just a few months earlier, and in circumstances that multiplied the pain. There have, of course, been other kinds of painful losses during this pandemic. The loss of financial security, the loss of jobs, the loss of health, the loss of contact with others. I think we can all enter into the experience of these women as they journeyed towards Jesus' tomb. But as they walked, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary and Salome had their grief abruptly interrupted by a very practical and mundane thought. Who's going to roll the stone away? When we are experiencing grief, there is often a cruelty to the mundane. Ordinary things intrude on our experience of grief and demand that we tear our attention away from the loved one that we've lost. Journeying to the tomb, the women would have been remembering Jesus, his words, his actions, his smile, and then the practical considerations of their task demanded their attention. But as they consider the challenge this huge stone that blocked the entrance to the tomb posed, it would have reminded them of how alone they now felt without him. Things like these were never much of a problem for Jesus. And this is the cruelty of the mundane. Ordinary tasks must be performed even when we are in the depths of grief. How can we do this? Where will we find the energy? Even what's the point? But somehow we do turn our attention to the mundane. And so we do so, and as we do so, we are reminded by that mundane activity of how our loved one would have done it, how they would have approached the task, of how they used to help us with things like this. There is a cruelty to the everyday when our days are filled with loss. But they had to think about this stone. It wasn't something they could leave on the back burner until they were in a better place emotionally. They had to anoint Jesus' body, as there'd been no time to do so when he was buried. And so this absurd challenge of moving the stone had to be met somehow. And so their conversation turns away from Jesus to this very practical but immense task, the mundane. It makes demands on us at times when we are least able to meet them. In the depths of grief, even there, life must go on. Things must be done. Stuff must be sorted. And there is also a danger in this. The necessity of the mundane can become a kind of trap door through which we slip in order to escape the intensity of our grief. So long as we are busy thinking about all the stones we've got to move in our lives, all the stuff we've got to sort, all the things that must be done, we don't have to stop, and we don't have to feel the loss, feel the emptiness, feel the hurt. When the women arrive at the tomb, they find that the stone has already been rolled away. How exactly this has happened no longer seems important, because what this shifted stone reveals is that Jesus has been risen from the dead. Jesus is alive. And in this moment, the mundane, which only a short while before was intrusive and cruel, is completely transformed. No longer is it a reason for bitterness or an excuse to avoid a painful reality. Now, it's a window onto the extraordinary. A new future has been created. Jesus is risen from the dead, and this mundane thing, this most mundane of things, this stone, has revealed that truth. Jesus is risen from the dead, and now death is defeated. The stone is no longer an issue, of course. But there are other mundane matters that need attention. But now they can be done in hope. No longer absurd, no longer painful, no longer complicit in denial. The everyday tasks are now pointing towards an extraordinary day when the risen Jesus will raise us all. Our loved ones, those whom we have lost, will be raised, and us with them, because death was defeated when that lump of rock was rolled aside.